In 1964, the Beatles released the film A Hard Day's Night. It was universally popular. It still holds a 98% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where it's considered a rock and roll movie classic. Next, in 1965, the Beatles released Help. This was also very popular, although perhaps not as popular as its predecessor. In 1966, they released The Beatles at Shea Stadium, which was just really mostly a concert video. But in 1967, they released their third actual movie, The Magical Mystery Tour. And it's fair to say that this one did not fare so well as any of its predecessors, not by a long shot. The film was directed by the Beatles themselves, who were heavily into the drug scene at the time and had no proper training or experience in directing. The whole thing was put together in an utterly chaotic and amateurish way, with no script and almost every line being improvised on the spot. Then, just to add a little more calamity into the mix, the brightly coloured psychedelic movie was then premiered on Boxing Day 1967 in black and white, so none of the bright psychedelic colours were actually visible. The nonsensical storyline, the chaotic direction, the lack of any real explanation of the concept, and the disastrous premiere all conspired to make this the Beatles' first abject crash and burn failure. The movie was critically panned and left critics and the audience bewildered, to the point that, despite the Beatles' incredible standing in pop culture, no American network was even willing to screen the film. The public reaction was so bad, in fact, that Paul McCartney had to go on TV onto David Frost's programme the day after it aired to explain himself, and probably to try and limit the damage a little bit, as audience members and critics alike began suggesting that the Beatles had officially lost it. You've probably seen Hard Day's Night. You may also have seen Help, but this does tend to fly under the radar a little bit more, and it gets screened a lot less often. But if you have seen it, you probably experienced something like I did the first time I saw it as a teenager. Just absolute confusion. To me, this film seemed, on first encounter at least, just a deranged, druggy montage of nonsensical madness. And yet, looking back on that idea, it does now in context seem to be just a little bit incongruent. It came right after what most of the music world consider to be the Beatles' most meaningful masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper. The two projects were inseparable. The title track of Mystery Tour was recorded just 4 days after the completion of Pepper, so it was probably written during. The two projects literally overlap. Did the Beatles really go from making one of the greatest album masterpieces the world has ever seen straight into making one of the worst pieces of gibberish nonsense film the world has ever seen? Literally without a break, from the best to the worst? Consider as well the quality and genius of the songs they contributed to the Magical Mystery Tour album. Fool on the Hill, I Am the Walrus, songs that are brilliant and legendary in their own right. Did they really create these musical masterpieces only to throw them away on a silly, self-indulgent piece of nonsense that could have been slapped together by a 12-year-old? Personally, as the years have gone by, I've started to think the answer to that question is no. Take as well John Lennon's comments that this album, The Magical Mystery Tour, was his favourite of all the Beatle records. He liked the stuff they did for this album better than Revolver, better than Pepper, better than Abbey Road. Paul too, at first, was proud of the film and defended it. But why? Is there actually something there, some kind of meaning that they were trying to transmit that this time almost everybody missed? In answering that question, we have to ask another one. What kind of film is this? Are we watching it in the right way? Is there some underlying meaning to this that the Beatles had hoped would resonate just like Pepper did, but instead ended up getting both missed and misunderstood for the next 50 years? So, to figure out what kind of film we're dealing with here, we have to start with what the Beatles themselves, the filmmakers, said about it. While all 4 of them were involved, really the mantle of leadership was laid at the feet of Paul McCartney. According to Beatles aide Pete Brown, McCartney was primarily responsible for the project insisting it would be warmly received, as Pepper had been. And this was despite staff from Brian Epstein's music company unanimously telling him it was awful and would be an embarrassment to the band. Now, over the years, since the film was such a flop, the Beatles have remained quite tight-lipped about what it means. But here and there, Paul in particular has revealed little snippets of information that can be kind of assembled to try and make some sort of sense of it all. And in the commentary to the Blu-ray of the film, Paul gives us two little nuggets of information that are really useful.
The thing was, by this point in our careers, we wanted to have control over what we were doing, because that was happening in the recording studio. So we wanted to make this kind of sort of film based on almost like cinema verite, like a reality show.
So here Paul says this film is something called cinema verite. But what is that? Here's how Wikipedia defines this kind of film. Cinema verite, or truthful cinema, is a style of documentary filmmaking which combines improvisation with use of the camera to unveil truth or highlight subjects hidden behind reality. Very mysterious, a filmmaking style based around improvisation, making things up on the spot, designed to reveal secret hidden meanings. And that's what Paul says the Magical Mystery Tour film is. Much of the film and the dialogue was improvised, but that doesn't actually betray a lack of meaning, because that's what you do in this form of filmmaking. And here's the other interpretive key. The improvised characters played in the film are also based on the work of Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini.
And we were really looking for the kind of Fellini characters that might be in a sort of Cirque du Soleil, a magical group.
Fellini was at this time experimenting with LSD. Just listen to how he approached making one of his most successful films of the 1960s. Fellini started making a film with the working title The Beautiful Confusion. It had no script, no official title. He hadn't even decided what the occupation of the main character was. This project began in 1960 and started production in 1962. But apart from having come up with a name for his hero, Fellini still had no idea what the film was going to be about. Instead of sitting down and writing something, he would go out into the countryside looking for the film. And as filming began, he had no script, no plot, no characters, and no idea. As the camera rolled, all the actors were simply improvising endlessly and chaotically on set, and he was filming it. This disorganised madness rolled on for a while until he finally hit breaking point, held up his hands and said, "I have no film." And then, right at the last moment, he realised he was the story. He put the film together telling his own story as the director looking for his film. Because he was a filmmaking genius, he pulled it all together in the end, made a classic film. It was called 8½, and it actually won an Oscar. Now Paul had seen the success that Fellini had had, and as he said on this commentary, was inspired to copy him. No proper script, no clearly defined roles, endless random improvising on set. And we get a little more insight into the nature of this film, into what it is and how it should be watched, from the interview Paul gave on December the 27th, 1967, when he appeared before the nation to defend the movie after the massive backlash.
It's been clear to us today that really there's been one main controversy in Britain today. It was the differing views on one television programme last night. The Beatles' music brings unanimous enthusiasm and approval pretty well. Last night their television show did not bring unanimous enthusiasm and approval, and everyone seems to have been discussing it today. Good evening, Mr. McCartney. Why don't you think that the critics liked this film?
I don't know, they just didn't seem to like it. I quite liked it myself.
But I mean, why were people so puzzled by it?
I think they thought it was bitty, which it was a bit. But it was supposed to be like that. I think a lot of people were looking for a plot, and there wasn't one.
Is the fact that it didn't get across to a lot of people, does that fact, alter your opinion of it? Do you say, right, it seems to have failed, or do you still think it's precisely as good as if people had said it was very good?
Yeah, I think it's as good as I always thought it was. But when we were making it, I think all of us thought, we hope this idea of doing a thing without a plot works, because the one thing we're going to be able to say is it hasn't got a plot.
So, despite almost everyone hating it, Paul still likes it. He still stands by it. And he tells us something really interesting. It was meant to be bitty by design. It isn't actually meant to have a plot. This isn't a linear movie with a start, a middle and an end. So if you're looking for a normal story, you aren't going to find one because there isn't one there. That is not the kind of film that this is.
I mean, what's the difference between what you were trying to do here and, say, if you took an EP of Magical Mystery Tour and played that while looking at a kaleidoscope?
That's the thing, there's no real difference between that, except that we had people in the kaleidoscope. I mean, it's not really all that disconnected. The trouble is that if you watch it the second time, it does grow on you, And this is one thing we forgot. When you make a record, a lot of people listen to our records and say, well, I don't like that one, but the second time round, they say, well, it's not bad. And then after a few plays, they say,
but are the BBC going to show it 17 times?
Yes. I'm just saying.
Did you catch what Paul said there? It actually isn't all that disconnected. Paul seems to confirm that just like a well-constructed and complex album takes multiple listens to really appreciate, you also need to watch the film multiple times to properly get it. And really interestingly, he seems to say that the film itself exists kind of as a setting for the songs. In later years, Paul, on the Blu-ray commentary, explains how the songs and the film were all constructed around one another.
So we just worked out little bits of business and went on the trip. And then later we introduced songs that had been kind of written with the whole project in mind.
How often do you have a message? Do you often say, I hope a point gets across to people out of that?
No, I never say that. But anything has a message. Everything has a message. But you can't just pick out one little thing and say, is that got a message? And everything we do is never intended to have a deep message. But it has.
So, just to sum up what we've covered so far, when you watch Magical Mystery Tour, if you are expecting an ordinary film, an ordinary story with a beginning, a middle and an end, you are going to be disappointed. It's not the same as Hard Day's Night or Help. It's a completely different genre of film. So, now we've covered what kind of film this is, let's start delving into that message. Where did it come from, and what is it? As I've already mentioned, there was no break at all between the ending of Pepper and the starting of Mystery Tour. They literally overlapped with the recording of the title track. Now listen to what McCartney himself has said about the recording of that first song and the massive clue he gives us as to what the whole project means. Because those were psychedelic times, it had to become a magical mystery tour, a little bit more surreal than the real ones. Roll Up was a reference to rolling up a joint. We were always sticking in those little things that we knew our friends would get. Veiled references to drugs and trips. Magical Mystery Tour is waiting to take you away. That's a kind of drug. It's dying to take you away is a Tibetan Book of the Dead reference. Magical Mystery Tour was the equivalent of a drug trip, and we made the film based on that. Now, as is very well attested by multiple interviews and multiple sources, the Beatles, Lennon and Paul in particular, weren't into the Tibetan Book of the Dead itself. They were into this. This is my battered copy of Timothy Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience. This is a reinterpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, all about death and reincarnation. And what this book does is reinterpret the ancient Tibetan text and applies it to an acid trip. The idea being that while on an acid trip and still alive, if you follow the Tibetan death ritual, you can go through something called personality death or ego death, meaning you can allow your old personality to die, and as you come out of the trip, you can choose a new one. Very odd, I know, but back then in that phase of the 60s, it was a really big deal. This book was particularly important to John Lennon. In a previous video, I explained the song Tomorrow Never Knows, which Lennon openly wrote as a literal chapter-by-chapter abbreviation of this book, every verse being basically lifted from its pages in sequential order. 7 steps in the book to correspond to 7 verses from Lennon. By the time of Revolver, John Lennon was already a full convert to Timothy Leary. Paul took a little longer, however. It was actually during the recording of Pepper that Paul took acid with John for the first time, on the same night they recorded the song Getting Better. And according to Beatles author Jonathan Gould, following this, during the Pepper sessions, John apparently took on the role of psychedelic guide to Paul. And then, of course, by the next project, we have Paul into the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So it was during Pepper that John introduced Paul to Timothy Leary's LSD reincarnation ritual. From Revolver all the way through to Magical Mystery Tour, it really is difficult to overstate the importance of this book to the Beatles. Now, when Lennon wrote Tomorrow Never Knows, he took the 7 stages from the book and wrote verses about them. And interestingly, we have exactly the same progression here in the movie, but this time written by Paul. 7 stages that correspond directly to the book. Because I've already covered Timothy Leary's book in quite close detail in a different video, the one on Tomorrow Never Knows, in this video I'm just going to give you the little quotes as they occur to line up with Paul's script. Timothy Leary's book, however, is just one of several very useful resources we have to assist with deciphering this movie. We also have Paul's circular script, which was published in the booklet that came with the Blu-ray. And there it is. Paul's script was not filled in very clearly at all. Just the first 2 or 3 segments contain any detail, after which it all tails off into almost nothing. But here's a recreated version I put together, in which the text is a little more legible. Now, when it comes to making sense of Paul's script, one of the first things I did was to work through the movie in order, and using his notes for what starts and finishes a section, I then filled in all the gaps. By simply watching the movie with the script in front of me, I was able to fill in all the blanks and create a completed version of the script. And, interestingly, every segment contains the same 2 elements. A little bit of story, and then a sort of music video. The only exception to this is sections 5 and 6, which interestingly, in Paul's original doodle, are actually joined together anyway with 2 small inner circles. They're labelled with just one word, dreams. And these 2 sections are actually just one section, containing 1 bit of storyline between them and 1 music video. Hence those 2 inner circles. So technically speaking, what we actually have here is a circular script split into 7. That funny numbering discrepancy about sections 5 and 6 on Paul's script is made even more interesting for the conspiracy nuts by a note on the opening page of the booklet, because the very first little passage you read in the booklet accompaniment seems to suggest that the numbering in the project isn't necessarily accurate. Away in the sky, beyond the clouds, live 4 or 5 magicians. Then at the end it says, "Are you ready to go?" Splendid. The story begins on page 7 or 8. Now remember that Paul was involved with the occult at this time, doing tarot cards and all that stuff. So you could kind of, in one sense, see this circle split into 7 as a kind of magic circle, which is very fitting for the Magical Mystery Tour. And of course, this idea of life being a 7-stage circle lines up with Timothy Leary's book once again, where we have a circle of birth, life, death, reincarnation, round and round and round and round and round. And that idea of life being a circle is, in my opinion, the central foundational theme of this entire project. Now, I mentioned there the booklet, the companion to the film that was released with the music. In that booklet was another resource that we can use to try and make some kind of sense of this movie, which is a cartoon strip version of the film. And here, once again, we have unreliable numbering, because the cartoon strip, every picture is numbered and it constantly goes out of sequence with the film. It also includes all kinds of other little Easter eggs, including dropped scenes that never actually made the final cut, and even just behind the scenes footage that was never actually meant to be part of the movie in the first place. And I wonder if that was perhaps intentional on their part to reinforce the idea that this movie is about the message, not the plot. Any attempt to turn this into a start-to-finish linear story is doomed to fail. We also have Paul's audio commentary on the Blu-ray. It doesn't contain a ton of new information, but it does contain a few really valuable moments, as we've already seen, that help explain the movie. We also have the Beatles Anthology 7, and of course we have the film itself and the songs as well. And so, just as films of this genre are full of hidden meaning and symbolism, so too we're going to try and interpret the songs with all those double meanings and wordplay that Paul said is included. Magical Mystery Tour is about a drug trip and personality death. It has intentionally been made with a message but not a plot, so we have to suspend our normal way of viewing a movie and instead pay special attention to symbolism to try and make sense of it. Expect a hidden message being communicated through a montage of images and sounds. That's how this form of movie works. But now we know what we're up against in making sense of this, which is a lot more than the general public did on Boxing Day in 1967. So, with all that background knowledge in our pockets, join me now as I make a spirited attempt to decipher and make sense of one of the strangest and most confusing things the Beatles ever released. So let's get stuck in by looking at the first segment of the circular script. To judge by Paul's notes here, this whole thing is really just an introduction to the film, and we see a montage of shots from the film over which the first Beatles song, Magical Mystery Tour, is played. And as we've already seen, most of these lyrics are a wordplay, a double meaning for joining the Beatles on a drugs trip. While the song plays, in the first scene, Ringo buys a ticket from John Lennon in disguise. Ringo then looks directly into the camera at us, the viewers, and he waves. We then see a full screen picture of a crowd waving back. And because Ringo kind of breaks the fourth wall here a little bit, he looks directly into the camera at us, the viewers, and then we see a great big load of people all looking back. I think every time we see these wide crowd shots, that represents us, the viewing audience. Remember that this is a film that is basically all symbolism. So when we see these shots, they represent us, and they reoccur constantly at key moments all the way through the movie. The montage continues, and then as the song ends, we see the audience all run away excitedly out of shot. They then all appear in front of the parked Magical Mystery Tour bus, clapping and applauding excitedly. And so, what this symbolises is that we, as the viewers, by watching this film, have accepted the Beatles' invitation to join them on this trip. We are all about to get on the bus with the Beatles, and then, once again, symbolically, all of a sudden, a policeman rises up out of the crowd, waves at them all, and then leaves. No police or authorities allowed on this kind of trip. And with that, the opening song and montage is completed, and the movie begins in earnest. Here's how it starts in the comic strip version. Ringo and Aunt Jessie are always quarrelling about one thing or another, but they both agree it would be exciting to go on a mystery tour. Your Uncle Jack always liked a charabanc trip, says Aunt Jessie, and this is a magic trip, adds Ringo. Ringo and Aunt Jessie reach the bus, which is waiting for them. A few days later, very early in the morning, they set off to start the tour. Aunt Jessie looks at the big bus and smiles. It's all yellow and blue, my favourite colours. When everyone is ready, Jolly Jimmy Johnson, the courier, climbs aboard. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the Magical Mystery Tour. I am your courier. All my friends call me Jolly Jimmy, and you are all my friends. Everyone comfy? Splendid. Then Jolly Jimmy introduces the tour hostess, the delightful Wendy Winters. And now we come to the idea of the bus itself. The use of a psychedelic, brightly painted bus is largely believed to have come from an American leader in the hippie movement called Ken Kesey and a group of hippies called the Merry Band of Pranksters. This is the original Magical Mystery Bus, which a few years earlier, in 1964, had ferried a group of drug-taking hippies all over America in an attempt to make a road movie. The whole thing, however, was just an exercise in drug-fueled chaos, and Kesey's edit of the film was never completed or released. And when the bus would stop on its drives across the states, stoned hippies would wander off and not return, resulting in the famous quote from Kesey, "You're either on the bus or off the bus." And by the time of Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, the whole idea of being on the bus had entered popular culture as a reference to being part of the hippie movement. It kind of meant being on the drugs and peace and love bandwagon. And a few years after the Merry Band of Pranksters, here we have the Beatles with their own brightly coloured bus, making a film about a drug trip and inviting people to join them. While the origins of this symbolism are a bit obscure today, a bit more of a footnote in the history books, back then nobody would have missed that reference. This first section of the script corresponds to the introductory chapter of the psychedelic experience, which says, "You are now about to begin a great adventure, the journey out of your mind. Trust your brain and trust your travelling companions." And so we've come to the end of the first segment of the script. We've had a song set to video and a little bit of story. On now to section 2. In the second segment of Paul's script, he's only written Coach People Meet Each Other, Song, Fool on the Hill, and Recruiting. So, first up in this section of the script, everyone on the bus meets each other. We're introduced to various members of the cast who are going on this trip with the Beatles. "Who is that man?" whispers Wendy Winters. "That's Mr. Buster Bloodvessel," answers Jolly Jimmy. "He's quite harmless. He thinks he's the courier. Last trip he thought he was the driver." After we meet Buster Bloodvessel, we see Paul sat next to a movie star. Her name is Miss Maggie Gabriella. There's a dwarf on the bus called Little George who asks permission to take photos of Miss Maggie Gabriella, the movie star. Paul and Maggie say yes, and then Paul looks out of the window and begins to drift off into a dream. "This is my lucky day," chuckles Little George, who loves to take lots of pictures. Meanwhile, Paul begins to daydream. His thoughts fly far away. He is standing high up on a warm, grassy hill. And so, the second song begins, The Fool on the Hill. And this is a track packed with wordplay and double meaning. Remember, according to Paul, all the songs in this film were written with both double meanings and the context of the film, a drug trip, in mind. The song starts, "Day after day, alone on a hill, the man with the foolish grin is keeping perfectly still." The whole time this song is playing, the camera just shows Paul standing on a hill in France, or acting strangely in the French countryside. The camera being exclusively focused on him the whole time makes it pretty clear that he is probably the fool. He is singing about himself, and he confirms this in the Blu-ray commentary, where he sheds a little light on why he called himself the fool. It was apparently the tarot card he identified with the most.
We had our outfits made by a group of people we knew from London called The Fool, who used to read the tarot cards, hence the name, The Fool being one of the tarot characters. I always used to come out as the Fool. First I thought, oh, it's a bit lousy, couldn't I be a king or something? They would say, no, that's a very good card. It gained significance as the film went along.
The next line says, "Well on the way, head in a cloud." There's a really interesting point about this line. Do you remember that the end of Sgt. Pepper's and the beginning of Magical Mystery Tour, they literally kind of overlap? Well, right at the end of Sgt. Pepper, we have Paul in the song A Day in the Life, getting on a bus, smoking something, and passing into a dream. And here we find him in the first song that's actually part of the story, in a film about a drug trip, on a bus, well on the way, with his head in a cloud. For those of you who like kind of connecting all the dots, you could choose to see this literally as the next chapter in the Pepper story. Of course, not everyone considers Pepper to be a full-blown concept album, so it's very much up to the individual viewer, but you really could say Pepper ends with Paul in a bus going into a dream. Magical Mystery Tour starts with Paul on a bus going into a dream. There's some kind of connection. There are other connections between Pepper and Mystery Tour as well. Interestingly, according to Lennon, Pepper was also written using a circular script. and I've not heard of Paul doing that on any other projects other than these two. They are two very closely related projects, both also packed full of LSD-inspired imagery and ideas. The next line says, "The man of 1,000 voices talking perfectly loud." So here again, we get the idea that this film actually works on multiple different levels. Paul describes himself as the man of 1,000 voices, so he's communicating his message in multiple different ways. And he says he's doing so clearly enough for anyone who understands to pick up that message. But nobody wants to know him. They can see that he's just a fool, and he never gives an answer. And nobody seems to like him. They can tell what he wants to do, and he never shows his feelings. And he never listens to them. He knows that they're the fools, but they don't like him. So again, here we have Paul kind of telling the audience that he is never going to give an answer. He's never going to explain the message. You have to kind of pick it up or not. You're on the bus or you're off the bus. And isn't it interesting how, in the lyrics to this song that opens the storyline, Paul seems to accurately predict that most people are not going to understand or like what he is saying or doing in this film. I think it's fair to say, on some level, Paul was fully aware of the reception this would get. And of course, this song has a connection to Timothy Leary's book as well. If you remember, that book is all about the circle of birth, life, death and reincarnation. And in this song, Paul makes constant double meaning wordplay references to circles. Remember, the film was written on a circular script. They filmed much of this movie on a circular road on an unused RAF base. The bus trip is circular, returning to where it started. And now look at the lyrics to Fool on the Hill. The fool on the hill sees the sun going down, and the eyes in his head see the world spinning round. And then he goes round and round and round and round. He literally sings round, 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 round. Notice as well that here in the music video we have Paul watching the sun going down, and that corresponds exactly to what we would get in Timothy Leary's book here in the second step. This second step is called the clear light, or the void, and it's meant to be the first kind of mystical experience on this guided acid trip. You behold a great bright light. The song fades out and we cut back to the bus. Suddenly, Paul's daydreaming is over. He hears the delightful voice of the hostess. "I just wanted to say that if there is anything I can do for you, your wish is our command. But I wonder where the magic comes in," thinks Paul. Back on the bus now, we see George and John kind of lolling around drunkenly in their seats while creepy fairground music plays in the background. John Lennon then narrates, "As the bus leaves the town behind and heads for the country, everything begins to change, and already the magic is beginning to work." So this is where we enter the hallucination phase. And interestingly, this is also the place where the comic strip goes completely out of sequence with the film. Jumping miles ahead to number 21. Presently, driver Alf brings his bus to a halt outside a strange building. "What a funny place," remarks John. "I don't like the look of it," adds George. "We're just passing through," says Wendy Winters reassuringly. Before long, Jolly Jimmy has led everybody into an official sort of office. Behind an old desk sits Major McCartney, looking very important. Beside him stands Sergeant Spinetti, looking over his shoulder. The bus has made its first stop at an army recruiting base. Sergeant Spinetti and Major McCartney are sat at a desk on which there is a sign reading, "I, you, was." This is again probably connected to the idea of the oneness that they would experience on an acid trip. It's a bit similar, isn't it, to "I am he as you are me" from I Am the Walrus. It's also interesting to see that it says "God save the king" on the wall, rather than the Queen, who was actually on the throne at the time of making that film. This then could be taken to represent the previous generation, their parents' generation, who went to war in the Second World War under a king. "Just follow me," whispers Jolly Jimmy, "and if they try to get you to join up, don't take any notice." Now that is easier said than done. Eventually they leave the sergeant screaming about haircuts and other military things. So the guests from the tour come in and Sergeant Spinetti lines them up and barks and bellows at them in constant gibberish, presumably trying to get them to join up. And this constant stream of yelled nonsense carries on until Ringo interjects with a one-word question. Why? The outraged sergeant responds with a further torrent of furious verbal diarrhea, finishing with his one and only recognisable line, which is, "And get your bloody haircut." The camera zooms into his open mouth and then zooms out to show that they have all of a sudden, reappeared outside. The guests, the sergeant and Paul, still at his desk, have reappeared in a field where the sergeant is attempting to show them how to enter into hand-to-hand combat with a large stuffed cow. So what the hell does this mean? Remember that the previous generation who lived through the Second World War had to be hard as nails. They had to endure the Second World War, the Blitz, rationing. They had to fight tooth and nail against the Germans just to ensure their own continued survival. But now the war was over. The cultural pendulum was swinging back the other way, and the young people of that time didn't want to be like their parents' generation. They were kind of reacting against it. They didn't want to regard the Germans as enemies, for example. Certainly the Beatles didn't, who had previously lived, worked and made friends in Germany. They didn't share the prejudices or the worldview of their parents' generation. And that's what I think Sergeant Spinetti represents with God Save the King on the wall, the parents' generation. He's trying to recruit them to live and think in the same way their parents did. And that's what learning to battle the stuffed cow is all about. It's an example of the dangerous enemy they need to learn how to fight. Keep in mind this isn't an ordinary film, it's all symbolism. However, while the sergeant attempts to recruit the guests, Jimmy the courier, dressed all in white, leads some of the guests away in a line. The other guests then all join the procession with Wendy, also dressed all in white, bringing up the rear. Interestingly now, in Timothy Leary's book, we are into a phase called the secondary clear light, and this is where the travellers on this trip are encouraged not to be distracted, not to lose their focus on the clear light. And so here, one by one, the guests leave the shouting sergeant. As the last one of them leaves, the sound of a large crowd giving 3 cheers is overdubbed onto the image. And so, as the guests reject the army's recruiting drive and all leave, we have completed section 2. We've had a bit of story and we've had a music video. And now we go on to section 3. And script segment 3 cuts straight to a scene of children playing, and in the Blu-ray commentary Paul says this represents their memories of their childhood.
I think the sequences were just suggested, often by memories from our childhood, often by things that we'd remembered or we remembered seeing or doing ourselves. So for instance, tug of war was something you'd see at all the village fetes. So a lot of these things found their way in as ideas.
So it's almost as if they've got on the bus, they've rejected their parents' way of life, and now they've been born anew. They're starting a new life. Interestingly, Timothy Leary's book states at this point, just as an infant must wake up and learn from experience the nature of the world, so a person must wake up in this new brilliant world and become familiar with its own peculiar conditions. So, as you by now probably expect, it still all lines up with the book. And now that we have that interesting moment of rebirth, I want to point out something else really fascinating about Paul's circular script. Isn't it interesting that the script is a circle, and that here, right near the beginning, we have new birth, and then, right at the end, we famously have a song all about death. It's called Death Cab for Cutie. It's about the circle of life. We have a reference to new birth here at the beginning, and we have a reference to death right at the end. More on that to come soon. In the strange village fete scene, children are having a tug of war, half-naked dwarfs are wrestling, adults are hopping up and down in sacks, vicars are playing blind man's buff, and cyclists are doing bike repairs. All the while, the Beatles song She Loves You is playing on a kind of chintzy fairground organ in the background. There are parents minding tiny infants in prams, and 2 men holding up a sign indicating what comes next. The Magical Mystery Tour Marathon. So, after new birth, after childhood, we enter the rat race, the race of life. This entire bizarre pantomime of characters, along with the guests on the tour bus, are all shooed to the starting line. A rugby team as well have appeared in their midst. Well, have you ever seen so many people in all your life? Everyone lines up for the start. The rugby team, the little wrestlers, the 5 cheating vicars, and all the people from the bus. Bang, they're off. When the starting gun is fired, everyone sets off, but the vicars all leave on get set, with a massive unfair head start. And, once again, in Leary's book, at this point we get a reference to a race of living forms. Some people jump in motorbikes on the way, the vicars steal the bicycles, and Ringo hijacks the tour bus as Mal Evans jumps in the boot, hitching a ride. Quite symbolic of how he was in real life, hitching a ride with the people who were at that time right at the forefront of the great race of life, the Beatles. It looks as though 5 vicars might win because they are cheating by riding bicycles, so some of the others use motorbikes and cars, which are much better ways of cheating. And at this point we cut back to another shot of us, the audience, who are all kind of pogoing up and down in excitement. Good old Ringo, he finds the best way of cheating by driving the magical bus. So the Mystery Tour team wins the big race in the end, which serves all the others right. And so I guess the symbolic message here is pretty straightforward. The best way to win the race of life is to be on the bus. But now we move on to the music video for section 3. There is a sudden flash of rainbow kaleidoscopic colour and we are back on the bus. The courier says if you look to your left, the view is not very inspiring, but if you look to your right, and at this point the instrumental song Flying kicks in over a montage of panoramic shots of Iceland, all coloured like purple and orange and yellow and green. And as that song draws to a close, John Lennon narrates, "Beyond the blue horizon, far above the clouds in the land that no one knows, live 4 or 5 magicians who spend their days casting wonderful spells. Come with me now into that secret place where the eyes of man have never set foot." So there again we've got wordplay, the eyes of man have never set foot. And of course once more we have that whole idea of playing with numbers, 4 or 5 wizards. The camera goes up into the sky where the 4 wizards are planning to cast magic spells on the magical mystery tour to make it both magical and mysterious. We find ourselves in a chemical laboratory with bubbling bottles and overflowing test tubes. The wizards appear to be making something in the test tubes. I wonder what that could be.
Paul, about a year and a half ago, there were quotes on the wire about your discussion of LSD and some other things, narcotics.
Yes, Larry.
It seemed to me from what I read that you had endorsed it and condemned it.
We were manufacturing it.
What's the story?
No, the business went bump.
On the wall behind the wizards are indistinct books covered in strange mystical diagrams, one of which looks quite like Paul's script. If anyone knows what these books are, please let me know in the comments below. Wizard George is peering through a telescope, watching the progress of the magical mystery tour bus. Mal Evans, the 5th wizard, is standing at the back of the room doing nothing, while Paul is once again sat at a desk scribbling in a book, just as he was in the army scene. Why is Paul always at a desk writing? Perhaps he was just making the point that mainly he wrote this. In the comic strip we leap backwards again to number 10. The magic is already beginning to work. Somewhere up in the sky, beyond the little white clouds, 5 magicians study their mysterious maps and gaze into their magic telescope. They are casting wonderful spells. Now, while all this is going on, Ringo is kind of wandering around and asking in a silly, high squeaky voice, "Where's the bus?" Which, of course, for a little while became a never-ending teenage catchphrase after we watched this movie as kids. Eventually, Paul consults his astrological charts and tells Ringo that the bus is 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road. And what the hell is that supposed to mean? 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road? Well, 10 miles north of Dewsbury is the city of Leeds, a city whose name contains the letters L, S and D. So you could interpret this as Paul saying, in Leeds means they're on LSD. Amusingly, Leeds is in Yorkshire, and so from the word Leeds you can literally create the anagram LSD. But I'm not even slightly suggesting they intended that. It just made me laugh, so I thought I'd mention it. And so we come to the end of script segment 3. We've had a bit of story, the marathon, and we've had a music video, Flying. As you can see from Paul's circular script, the laboratory scene is the final scene from section 3. So we move now into the entirely unexplained section 4, in which there is only a doodled smiley face. And this section is a strange one, because not only is it the only section with nothing written in it in the script, it is also the only section that appears to have been completely omitted from the comic strip as well. We know what actually goes in here, however, because Paul's notes tell us exactly what happens right before and right after, so we can just fill in the blanks there. This is the love sequence between Aunt Jessie and Buster Bloodvessel, followed by the song and music video for I Am the Walrus. And so, directly after being in the laboratory with the wizards, we cut abruptly back to the bus, where Lennon continues to narrate. Meanwhile, back on the bus, things are happening and life lobbles on. Indeed, the magic is so powerful that even Mr. Bloodvessel emerges from his shell and he turns to speak. And there's just a little bit more wordplay for you. What do you get if you cross limp with hobble? Lobble. At this point, Buster Bloodvessel turns to talk to Aunt Jessie. He says, "My dear lady, doesn't intuition tell you what I feel? You bring out my I love you." And then Buster promptly passes out and we go into a dream sequence of Buster and Jessie on the beach. So let's ask the question that this film keeps throwing up. What the hell does that mean? Well, we've got on the bus, we've said no to the old way of life, we've been reborn into a new way of life, we've had childhood, after which we've entered the great race of life. Typically, what you might expect next in the great circle of life is searching for your romantic partner. It does kind of fit in, doesn't it? And of course, as we now expect, this lines up with what should come next in the acid trip according to Timothy Leary's book, an encounter with a joyful being, an angel of love. So we see Jessie and Buster kissing on the beach, he draws a love heart around her in the sand, and it's just a nice, sweet little romantic moment. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it abruptly finishes, and with no explanation at all, we're back on the bus. Buster speaks into the PA saying, "I am the courier. Good morning, men and women. Welcome. I am your friendly courier. I am concerned for you to enjoy yourselves within the limits of British decency." And then, once again, all of a sudden, with no explanation, we go straight into the music video for I Am the Walrus. Now, I don't actually believe there is a great deal of meaning, lyrically speaking, in this song. I think it's more a kind of stream of consciousness thing, representing the hallucination phase that they are now entering. There are only a few lines in this song that I want to kind of bring out and look at. The first is the opening line, "I am he, as you are me, and we are all together." When I read through the psychedelic experience, the opening line from Walrus was one of many Lennon lines of this era I felt were probably mostly lifted directly from its pages. Another line worth pointing out is "See how they fly, like Lucy in the Sky." Of course, Lucy in the Sky is a reference to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a track from the Sgt. Pepper album, which Paul McCartney has since confirmed is about LSD and drugs. So that line could be taken as confirming that this really is a stream of consciousness LSD trip song. And the last line I want to look at is, "Don't you think the Joker laughs at you?" Who's the Joker? Joker is a synonym for fool. So this really could be interpreted alongside the Fool on the Hill to say, Paul, the Joker, is laughing at the audience with this film. And then, as if confirming this idea, right after this phrase, the song hits a slightly creepy hee 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 ha 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 sound effect. And at that moment, reinforcing the idea that this comment is aimed at the audience, we see ourselves again, the crowd that represents the audience, for just a brief moment, laughing along with Paul. The music video finishes with a conga line of people following the bus and passing away into the distance. And the song fades out. On the script, we're now approaching the midpoint, lunchtime. And here is the only reference to section 4 in the comic book. Even as they dance, the magic takes effect and the bus is spirited away to the amazing musical land of the Walrus. "I am the Walrus," says John. "No, you're not," cries Nicola, laughing at his funny feathery hat. Nicola is the very youngest little girl on the bus. "I've got a present for you," says John, and he gives her a big red balloon. She hasn't quite enough puff to blow it up for herself, so John and George help her. So, right after I Am the Walrus, we see John Lennon goofing around with a little girl in quite a sweet way who is sat on his knee on the bus. He's blowing up a red balloon, and he offers the child a blow. The child says no, and then we see the audience cheering. Remember the wordplay and the druggy double meanings? Blow isn't meant for children. And seeing John with a little child on his lap also lines up with the kind of circle of life concept of this film. We've had new birth, then we entered the rat race, then we had a romantic encounter, next would typically come parenthood. Try to still keep in mind that the genre of this film, the style of the movie, means that pretty much everything you're seeing on screen is just symbolism. Next, Wendy Winters, the hostess, announces that it's 1:15, time for lunch. So, according to Paul's script, we have reached the midpoint. Next we have lunchtime, which does not appear in the film, but a version of it does appear in the comic strip. There are 7 comic strip pictures that describe various scenes from the movie that never actually made it into the final edit. This includes Nat's dream, which is a cut scene, and a behind the scenes moment when Jessie Robbins, the actress who played Aunt Jessie, demonstrated her quite impressive chops as a jazz drummer. And some of these moments can be watched in the special features of the Blu-ray. But now on to the next section, Section 5. As I've said a few times now, this section is really just one section, and you can see Paul indicated that on the script with 2 little inner circles joining 5 and 6 together. As if reinforcing this idea, sections 5 and 6 just have one word in them, dreams. And the other thing that makes it obvious this is actually just one section is it contains one bit of story and one music video, exactly the same as every section that's come so far. Now at this point in this section, which I'm going to accurately just call section 5, we have crossed the threshold into the notoriously weird and darkest inner sanctum of this movie, which, as always, lines up with Timothy Leary's book in sequential chronological order. This is where, having encountered a being of love previously, we now enter the nightmare phase, where you expect fearful and unpleasant encounters. Now I'm going to talk you through this scene, but just buckle up, because this whole section is just, frankly, demented. As the bus travels on after lunch, Aunt Jessie falls asleep. John narrates once again saying, "Aunt Jessie's hungry, and she's dreaming. She's dreaming about food. Beautiful food. Lettuce, potatoes, apples, lovely food, lots and lots of spaghetti." And we see Aunt Jessie's face in close-up, alternating between looking distressed and upset, and then absurdly over-the-top happy. As we pass into her dream, the scene then switches to a rooftop restaurant where everybody is sitting at tables and eating. Aunt Jessie sitting with Buster Bloodvessel, they are apparently now a couple, while everyone else is at other tables with many of the blokes topless and many of the women just in bras. John Lennon famously plays a waiter in this scene, in which he constantly shovels mound after mound of spaghetti onto Aunt Jessie's plate. It's a very strange and disturbing scene, and one that apparently came from a dream that John had just had. I don't know this, but probably while he was on acid himself. Jessie keeps eating and eating, while John shovels endless spaghetti, and Buster keeps passing over clean napkins that end up in the mass of spaghetti. No wonder people are a bit sleepy after all that racing around. Poor Aunt Jessie nods off and has a dream about mountains of spaghetti. "Wake up, Ringo! Wake up, Aunt Jessie! It is little George speaking." But she doesn't wake up. Aunt Jessie is now kind of crying a little bit as John keeps shoveling more and more spaghetti onto her plate. It's all extremely odd and creepy. And in the background is a Beatles track that still to this day has never been properly released, an incredibly strange hypnotic montage of sound called Jessie's Dream. Aunt Jessie gives up on the meal and leaves the table. John Lennon, the waiter, grinning, just continues to shovel. But then Jessie calls him, "Pirandello, help me up the stairs." Pirandello was an Italian playwright who is considered one of the forefathers of the theatre of the absurd. Jessie and John the waiter all go up to the top level, where we see people now drinking milk from the stuffed cow we saw in the first stop at the army base. and Aunt Jessie is now having an animated, friendly conversation with her tormentor, Pirandello the waiter. So, what the hell does all this madness mean in the context of the movie? Well, our first stop, as always, is looking at the meaning in Timothy Leary's book. He says that when you enter this phase, when you have nightmare visions of demons and hellish creatures, you should embrace them as old friends, rather than running from them or reacting in terror. And here we have Jessie being tormented by John the waiter, but she makes friends with him. And then we also see the passengers on the bus are now living at peace and in harmony with the stuffed cow that the army tried to train them to hate and attack. They have embraced their supposed enemy and found a way to coexist with them. Jessie wakes up, comes out of her dream, and the bus makes its next stop in a field. Everyone on the bus is now walking through the field towards a tiny white tent. If we all manage to squeeze into that tiny tent, it will be magic, declares Ringo. I won't tell you the marvellous and amazing things which will happen in the tent, but I will tell you it is magic. The entire crowd from the bus, including Jessie and Buster, who are now holding hands, enter the tent one after another and can fit in no problem. Of course, inside the tent is far bigger than it appears on the outside. Once inside, they all sit down in a small makeshift cinema, and the music video of this section begins. It's Blue Jay Way, written and sung by George, and the audience are all high as kites, screaming and whooping just before it comes on. George is singing and miming inside a smoky garage with a chalk keyboard drawn onto a pavement. The words "two wives and kid to support" are written out on the pavement next to him, and there's a cup out, just as if he's a beggar. Towards the end of the song, we see what is actually on the other side of the projection screen, and it's the four Beatles and Mal, with John rocking backwards and forwards on a rocking horse from behind the curtain. While there is a story about how George composed the song about literally sitting in a house in Blue Jay Way in LA, it also fits in very nicely, typical double meaning style, with this film. The song paints a picture of people lost in a fog-laden city trying to find their way through the dark, misty streets. And look what we find next in Timothy Leary's book as we are getting ready for the period of re-entry. A kind of restless, unhappy wandering, like a person travelling alone at night along a highway. So Blue Jay Way really could be seen as representing the final phase, kind of the misty, foggy, in-between place before you are reincarnated. And one really interesting line from this song is "Please don't be long," which for many decades now has been interpreted by some Beatle fans as actually being another wordplay. This could be reinterpreted as George reaching out to the listener and telling them not to belong. Instead, be different. Don't be convinced into joining the army. Get on the bus instead. The song finishes with the magical mystery bus approaching George from behind, as if to run him over. But the film freezes, not showing what happens next. Then the guests all burst out in rapturous applause, having watched the music video, and leave the tent. And so the combined sections of 5 and 6 have completed in exactly the same way as every section before them. Story, followed by relevant music video. And just like the 7 verses of Tomorrow Never Knows, we are still lined up with the 7 stages of Timothy Leary's book. At the beginning of section 6, we see the wizards once again. Lennon comes in with tea for them all and asks for an update on the location of the bus. And Paul says it is still 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road. So the bus is exactly where it was before. They haven't moved an inch. Despite having travelled to multiple locations and seen multiple strange sights, they are still 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road. And as I mentioned the first time this comment occurred earlier in the film, this could be Paul just doing yet another wordplay. Leeds contains the letters LSD. They're still on the trip. At last one of the magicians looks up from his work. The bus is 10 miles north on the Dewsbury Road, and they're having a lovely time, he cries. The others dance with glee. They're having a lovely time. And now, for some reason, we leap forward again to picture number 34. By now the sun is setting behind the hills, and it's time to head for home. Shirley, the accordionist, plays happy tunes while everyone sings the words. Even Mr. Bloodvessel. All the magic has made him forget. It's getting dark outside now. Everyone on the bus is having a drink, they've got beers in their hands, and the accordion player gets up and gets them all singing along with a bunch of folk songs. And all the way through, this is interspersed with footage of Paul and little George messing around on a beach. We see little George laid down on the beach while Paul bows down to worship the ocean. And then, at the end of the sing-song, the bus makes its final stop. And once they get off the bus, the men and the women separate. Jimmy takes the men and Wendy takes the women. Now, says Wendy Winters, we'll split into 2 groups. All the ladies this way, please. And all the men should come with me, chortles Jolly Jimmy, a special twinkle in his eye. I've got a nice surprise for you. Hello, says George, we're going into a striptease club. And they are too. Whoops, Johnny, hey, tee-hee-hee, cries John. Front row seats for all you lucky lads, shouts Jolly Jimmy, ordering up the drinks. So, the men and the women separate off to go to their respective strip clubs. The camera stays with the men, and as the show starts, the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band come on stage and start to perform Death Cab for Cutie. Now, did you know Paul always got called the cute one? He is right about to undergo the ego death talked about in Leary's book. And once again we get further insight into what's happening here in that book, still in sequential order, because at this point on the guided acid trip we should expect sexual visions and hallucinations of orgies. And of course, in the film, we have the men and the women going off to strip clubs. It still all lines up. So we've gone around a circular script. We got on the bus, said no to the ways of the previous generation. We were reborn into a new life. We entered the rat race. We found new love. We made peace with our enemies. We're experiencing free love now. And we're coming all the way around to death. I think at this point it's become pretty obvious that the film and the script are entirely about the circle of life. We have the song Death Cab for Cutie representing the moment of death. But there's still another section. So what comes after death? We are now into section 7, the last one, which opens with the song Your Mother Should Know. The Beatles are all standing on a winding staircase in white suits, wearing carnations. Ringo, George and John are wearing red carnations, while Paul's is black. A woman comes up and presents Paul with a bouquet of flowers, which he takes, and begins dancing separately to the other Beatles. Now this scene is often interpreted by people who are into the Paul is dead conspiracy as being a kind of funeral scene. And I actually think they're right. I think they've got the imagery correct, but the meaning wrong. Paul wearing a black carnation is symbolic. Him being given a bouquet of flowers is symbolic. But the real life Paul wasn't dead. This symbolised the death at the end of the circle of life. It's about metaphorical death. It's about death and then reincarnation, the circle. All of this takes place in a part of the Tibetan ritual called the third bardo. And interestingly, in this section in the book, we have Timothy Leary saying, "You may think, I am dead, what shall I do?" The 7 stages of the guided LSD trip have now been completed, and the voyagers are ready to be reborn, reincarnated into new personality. And just as if to confirm this, why are they all wearing carnations? Carnation, reincarnation. More wordplay. And now look at the song they're singing. Let's all get up and dance to a song that was a hit before your mother was born, though she was born a long, long time ago. It's almost as if we're going back in time, not just to the beginning, which would be section 1, but to before the beginning, before your mother was born. We're going to before our mother gave birth to us. We are in a place where we are preparing to be reborn. And then what would you expect as we're coming back to the beginning of a circle? We have the opening song starting playing again. Roll up for the mystery tour. The circle is restarting. All of a sudden the 4 Beatles reveal themselves, the Wizards. And as the credits roll, we see the Wizards and for the first time the audience who represent us, the viewers, all dancing and celebrating together. And the final comic strip says, Aunt Jessie and all the other people have never enjoyed a mystery tour so much in their lives. Thanks to Jolly Jimmy, Wendy Winters and the 5 mysterious magicians. And of course, thanks to John, Paul, George and Ringo. And yet again confirming that this is the start of the next circle, John Lennon comes on as a narrator and says, "And that was a magical mystery tour. I told you, goodbye." At which point, the outro from the song Hello, Goodbye kicks in. We're saying goodbye to the last circle and hello to the next one. So I think at this point we can properly label every stage in the circle. It's interesting as well to note that the cover to the audio version of Timothy Leary's book is in fact a circle divided into 7 sections. But there's still more to this whole concept, because a few years earlier Paul McCartney, under the influence of drugs, had had a strange vision. And in that vision he claims to have seen the meaning of life.
I had a mystical experience once at a party with Bob Dylan. I felt like I'm walking around and I'm going round and gradually going up a spiral walkway and get to the top and I go, I've got it. And I say to our roadie, Mal, I said, Mal, I've got to write this down and you keep this. So I wrote something down. I said, now you keep this and show it me in the morning. Don't lose it. This is the meaning. This is the meaning of life. In the morning, he shows me it. It said, there are 7 levels.
So, Paul had a vision of a spiral staircase. What does a spiral staircase do? It goes round and round and round, doesn't it? And within those circles are 7 levels. Starting to sound familiar yet? And as if to cap it all, here we see Paul and the Beatles in the final scene of the movie actually standing on a winding staircase. It's as if the whole thing has come full circle. Now here are a few follow-up questions that Vice asked Paul McCartney in regard to that little clip. You said in one of the episodes of your new documentary that you discovered the meaning of life in Bob Dylan's hotel room one night, and you wrote it down. The next day you found the piece of paper and it just said there are 7 levels. Has your interpretation of the meaning of life changed since then? Paul replies, I never quite knew what I meant that night. But the weird thing is, I've run into people who have said they got something from it. They start going into scriptures and ancient texts and stuff, and apparently there are people who say that about levels. My overriding concern was telling everyone back home. You know how you do that? If you do something great, you can't wait to tell your mates. Well, I thought I'd cracked the meaning of life, so I couldn't wait to tell everyone back home. Who knows? Maybe there are 7 levels is right. It certainly seemed very right that night. And so, of course, I can say nothing definitively, but as we kind of connect these dots, I can't help but wonder if that's what this film is. Paul, through quite obscure art forms, attempting to share with us his revelation about what the meaning of life is. It's a circle. This story works in countless different ways. This circle represents a Timothy Leary-style drug trip. It also represents the idea of reincarnation, but in it is also the progression both of one full day and one full life. This circle is quite literally both a day and a life. A day in the life. But now, at last, I want to come to my very final point about this movie, and it's one I haven't overlooked, but one I've intentionally left right to the end. Why such a preoccupation with death and reincarnation at this time? I think there might be a little more to it than just the fact that he was getting into Timothy Leary. And that's because one of the most seismic events in Beatle history occurred literally 15 days before the making of this film started. Sgt. Pepper was released in June 1967. 3 months later, at the end of August 1967, their manager, Brian Epstein, died of an overdose. And in September 1967, the same year, just over 2 weeks later, filming began on this project. I wonder if, on some level, this was partially at least Paul processing and coming to terms with the loss of such an irreplaceable influence and guiding figure in his life. Where would the Beatles have been without Epstein? His death must have hit them all really hard, Paul included. And when you look at that timeline and you realise that this film about death and reincarnation was made in a period when all of them would still have been right in the middle of grieving for the loss of the man who was, in my opinion, their leader, it takes on a slightly different vibe. On some level, I wonder if this was Paul expressing his grief, processing his feelings through his art. I wonder if this was, in some way, Paul saying, in the end, everyone dies, but even so, we might not yet have seen the last of our friend. Could Paul have been saying, life is a circle, so one day, Brian could be walking amongst us once again, but perhaps, maybe, wearing a slightly different costume.